The sirens echoed through the Beverly Hills mansion as Sarah was handcuffed in front of 5-year-old Ethan, who was crying desperately calling for her. Businessman Richard Thompson watched the scene coldly, holding a diamond necklace that had belonged to his late wife, convinced that the nanny had tried to steal it during an alleged escape with his son. What he didn't realize was that in a few hours, the security cameras would reveal a devastating truth that would forever transform his view on hasty judgments and the courage of a simple woman. Sarah Williams woke up every day at 5 in the morning in her small apartment in South Central Los Angeles, not by choice, but by necessity. At 28 years old, she carried on her shoulders the responsibility of caring for her mother, Margaret, who was battling advanced stage cancer. The money she earned as a nanny for the Thompson family barely covered the expensive medications and chemotherapy sessions, but Sarah never complained. There was something special about her that few noticed, an impressive photographic memory and an almost supernatural ability to observe details that others ignored. These skills, developed since childhood to help her illiterate mother deal with bureaucracy and documents, now made her an exceptional nanny, capable of anticipating Ethan's every need. Richard Thompson was the complete opposite of Sarah. Heir to a real estate empire, he had become even richer and more bitter after his wife's death in a car accident 2 years earlier. Grief had transformed him into a cynical and distant man who saw the world through lenses of distrust and superiority. For him, people like Sarah were just replaceable pieces in his organized and controlled life. Ethan, his only son, had become more of an appointment on his schedule than a source of joy. The child, traumatized by the loss of his mother and his father's coldness, found in Sarah the maternal figure he so desperately needed. She was the only person who could make him genuinely smile, who knew his favorite stories, and who comforted him when nightmares woke him in the middle of the night. The mansion's routine was rigid and impersonal. Richard left early for the office in downtown LA and returned late, leaving Ethan entirely in Sarah's care. The house, with its cold marble and minimalist decoration, looked more like a museum than a home. Sarah tried to bring life to that environment, organizing games in the garden, reading stories in the library, and teaching Ethan small lessons about kindness and compassion that his father never bothered to convey. She noticed everything: cars that passed too slowly down the street, the same man who appeared at Griffith Park where she took Ethan to play, the strange calls that came to the house when Richard wasn't present. Her sharp intuition caught signals that others would consider insignificant. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, hit that bell so you don't miss any emotional stories like this one that's just beginning. The tragedy began on a seemingly normal Thursday. Sarah had taken Ethan to the park as usual, but her attention was drawn to a man watching them from afar. It was the third time in a week that she had seen him in the same location, always wearing dark sunglasses and pretending to read a newspaper. Her photographic memory registered every detail: the haircut, the scar on his chin, the gold watch on his wrist. When they returned home, Sarah decided to tell Richard about her suspicions, but he dismissed her with an arrogant gesture, saying she was being paranoid and should focus only on taking care of Ethan, not inventing conspiracy theories. That same night, while Ethan slept and Richard worked in his home office, Sarah heard a strange noise coming from the garden. Her observation skills, always alert, caught the sound of careful footsteps on dry leaves. She approached the window and saw 3 dark figures moving toward the back of the house. Her heart raced when she recognized one of them. It was the man from the park. Without hesitation, Sarah ran to Ethan's room and, gently so as not to frighten him, woke him up whispering that they needed to play a very important game, staying in absolute silence while she took him to a safe place. Sarah's plan was simple but risky. She knew every inch of the mansion and knew there was a passage through the back of the kitchen that led to the side garden, away from the intruder's view. With Ethan in her arms, she moved through the shadows of the house, her breathing controlled and her movements precise. But when they reached the kitchen, Ethan stumbled and knocked over a pot, making a noise that echoed through the silent house. The kidnappers heard the sound and began violently breaking down the back door. Sarah knew she had only seconds to act. In a moment of desperation and determination, Sarah made a decision that would change everything. She grabbed the diamond necklace that had belonged to Claire, Richard's late wife, which was on the kitchen counter waiting to be stored in the safe. Her intention wasn't to steal, but to use the jewelry as a way to get attention and ask for help. She put Ethan in Richard's Mercedes, which was in the garage with the keys on the dashboard, and drove at high speed toward the nearest police station, with the necklace in her purse as evidence that something terrible was happening at the mansion. But fate played a cruel trick on Sarah. A few blocks from the police station, the car was intercepted by police in a routine checkpoint. When the officers saw a simple woman driving a luxury car with a frightened child in the back seat and an expensive necklace in her purse, they immediately assumed the worst. Ethan, traumatized and confused, was crying, asking to go home, which the police interpreted as fear of his supposed kidnapper. Sarah desperately tried to explain what had happened, but her words sounded like flimsy excuses from a criminal caught red-handed. Hit that like button if you're rooting for Sarah to prove her innocence in this desperate situation. Richard received the call from the police at 11 at night. When he arrived at the LAPD station and saw Sarah handcuffed, being interrogated like a common criminal, his rage exploded without control. For him, the scene confirmed his worst prejudices. The poor nanny had taken advantage of his trust to try to rob his family and steal his most precious possessions. Claire's necklace, his last tangible memory of his beloved wife, was there as irrefutable proof of the crime. Richard didn't listen to Sarah's explanations, didn't pay attention to the desperation in her eyes, didn't notice that Ethan continued asking for her even after they were separated. Ethan was taken home under the care of a temporary nurse, but the child was inconsolable. He couldn't understand why Sarah had been taken away by the police officers, why Daddy was so angry with her, why nobody believed she was good. Throughout the night, Ethan repeated the same phrase, "Sarah saved me, Sarah saved me," but the adults interpreted this as confusion from a child traumatized by the supposed kidnapping. At the police station, Sarah spent the longest night of her life in a cold, damp cell, surrounded by other women who were also fighting against a system that judged them by appearance and social origin. She thought about Margaret, who depended on her for the next day's medications, thought about Ethan, who must be scared and confused, thought about how her life had collapsed in a few hours for trying to do the right thing. But Sarah didn't give in to despair. Her sharp mind continued working, going over every detail of that night, preparing for the moment when she would have the chance to prove her innocence. Meanwhile, at the mansion, something disturbing was happening. The kidnappers, frustrated by not having found Ethan in the house, decided to return the next day. They had studied the family's routine for weeks and knew that Richard usually worked late, leaving the child vulnerable. The plan was simple: grab Ethan and ask for a millionaire ransom that Richard would certainly pay to get his only son back. What they didn't expect was that the suspicious nanny had ruined their plans with her hasty escape. The next morning, Richard woke up with absolute certainty that he had made the right decision by turning Sarah over to the police. His lawyer had already been contacted to ensure she received maximum punishment for the crime of kidnapping and theft. For Richard, that situation only confirmed his worldview. Poor people couldn't be trusted, especially when it came to his family's welfare. He couldn't see beyond his own prejudices and pain. Ethan, on the other hand, was increasingly agitated. The temporary nurse couldn't calm him down, and the child refused to eat or play. He stood at the window, looking at the street, waiting to see Sarah coming home. When Richard tried to talk to his son about what had happened, Ethan surprised him with disturbing clarity. "Sarah didn't hurt me, Daddy. She saved me from the bad men who came into our house." Richard dismissed his son's words as childish fantasy, a result of trauma. It was then that the investigator in charge of the case, Detective Martinez, an experienced and careful man, decided to review the evidence more carefully. Something in the story didn't fit perfectly. Why would a kidnapper take the child directly toward a police station? Why hadn't she tried to flee when intercepted by police? Why did the child show so much attachment to his supposed aggressor? These questions bothered him, and his experience told him that apparently simple cases often hid complex truths. Detective Martinez requested that Richard review the mansion's security camera footage, something that should have been done immediately but was neglected due to the apparent clarity of the case. Richard initially resisted, arguing that the evidence was already sufficient, but Martinez insisted, explaining that it was standard procedure and necessary to close the case definitively. Reluctantly, Richard agreed to accompany the analysis of the recordings at his own house. The moment of truth arrived when they sat in front of the monitor in the mansion's security room. The first images showed Sarah and Ethan returning from the park, nothing abnormal. Then, Sarah putting Ethan to bed, reading a story, kissing his forehead with maternal tenderness. Richard felt a tightness in his chest, seeing the tenderness he himself couldn't show his son. But it was at 10:47 p.m. that the devastating truth began to reveal itself. The cameras clearly captured 3 hooded men invading the mansion's garden, moving with military precision toward the back windows. One of them was visibly the same man that Ethan had mentioned, and that Sarah had tried to report unsuccessfully. Detective Martinez paused the recording and looked at Richard, who was pale and silent. "Mr. Thompson," Martinez said calmly, It seems your nanny was right about being watched. The recording continued showing Sarah waking up to the noises, checking on Ethan, and then making the heroic decision to get him out of the house. They could clearly see the moment she grabbed the necklace, but the context was now completely different. It wasn't theft, it was desperation from a woman trying to save a child. She had taken the necklace as evidence, as a way to prove to authorities that something terrible was happening at the Thompson house. Leave a comment telling what you would do in Richard's place at this moment of devastating discovery. Richard watched in total shock as the camera showed Sarah carrying sleeping Ethan in her arms, protecting him with her own body as she moved silently through the house. Every movement of hers demonstrated care and protection, not malice. When Ethan stumbled and made noise, they could see the exact moment Sarah made the decision to use the car to escape, not to kidnap, but to save. Her expression was one of maternal determination, not criminal greed. But the most shocking revelation was yet to come. The exterior cameras showed what happened after Sarah and Ethan left the property. The kidnappers, realizing they had lost their opportunity, didn't give up. They returned the next morning, taking advantage of Richard being at the police station and the house being unprotected. The images clearly showed the same three men trying to break into the house again, looking for Ethan, searching through his toys, his documents, anything that could help them find the child. Detective Martinez froze the image at a crucial moment, one of the kidnappers holding a photo of Ethan found in the child's room, talking on the phone with someone, clearly reporting that the target had disappeared. The man's body language was one of frustration and anger. "Mr. Thompson," Martinez said seriously, "your nanny didn't just save your son from a kidnapping. She probably saved his life." The reality hit Richard like a hammer. Sarah wasn't a criminal, she was a hero. While he slept peacefully, confident in his superiority and hasty judgments, a simple woman had risked everything to protect his son. She had used her intelligence, her courage, and her dedication to remove Ethan from a mortal danger situation. And as a reward, she had been humiliated, criminalized, and thrown in jail. The weight of the injustice he had committed hit Richard with full force. He thought of Sarah spending the night in prison, being treated as a criminal, while the real villains planned their next move. He thought of Ethan, traumatized not by Sarah's supposed kidnapping, but by the forced separation from the only person who really cared about him. He thought of his own arrogance, how his prejudices had almost cost his son's life. The tears that Richard hadn't shed in 2 years, since Claire's death, finally came. They weren't just tears of relief that Ethan was safe, but tears of deep shame for having failed as a father and as a human being. He had judged Sarah by her origin, by the color of her skin, by the simplicity of her clothes, without seeing the greatness of her character. He had treated as a criminal the woman who loved his son more than he himself demonstrated loving. Detective Martinez, witnessing Richard's emotional transformation, put a hand on his shoulder. "Mr. Thompson, there's still time to fix this. Sarah needs to be released immediately, and you need to thank her for saving your son. But more important than that, you need to ensure she's compensated for all the injustice she suffered." Richard didn't waste time. He immediately called his lawyer, not to prosecute Sarah, but to ensure she was released with all honors and that the real criminals were captured. He himself went to the police station, with Ethan by his side, to personally apologize to Sarah and publicly acknowledge the terrible mistake he had made. When Sarah was released, she emerged from the cell with the same dignity with which she had faced the entire ordeal. Her eyes showed tiredness, but not resentment. When she saw Ethan running toward her, her arms opened to receive him with the unconditional love that had motivated all her sacrifice. "Sarah! Sarah!" Ethan shouted, clinging to her as if she were his salvation. And in many ways, she really was. Richard approached slowly, with genuine humility stamped on his face. "Sarah," he said with a choked voice, "I made a terrible mistake. You saved my son, and I treated you like a criminal. Please forgive me. I have no words to express my gratitude and my shame." Sarah looked at him for a long moment, seeing no longer the arrogant and prejudiced man, but a father who had learned a devastating lesson about judgment and redemption. "Mr. Richard," Sarah said with her soft but firm voice, "I didn't do anything beyond what any person should do for a child in danger. Ethan isn't just my job, he's part of my family. I forgive you, but I hope this experience helps you see people for what they really are, not for what they appear to be." Richard's transformation was complete and irreversible. He not only rehired Sarah with a substantially higher salary, but also fully paid for Margaret's treatment, ensuring she had access to the best doctors and medications available. More importantly, he began treating Sarah not as an employee, but as a valued family member, someone whose opinion and well-being were important to him. The kidnappers were captured thanks to evidence from security cameras and Sarah's photographic memory, which provided detailed descriptions that led to the identification and arrest of the entire gang. The story spread through local media, transforming Sarah into a symbol of courage and integrity, and Richard into an example of how pride and prejudice can blind even the most intelligent people. Ethan, meanwhile, flourished under Sarah's renewed care and his father's newly discovered attention. Richard learned to be present in his son's life, to value the simple moments that Sarah had tried to show him for so long. The house, once cold and impersonal, became a true home, full of laughter, affection, and mutual respect. Sarah used part of the financial compensation she received to open a small daycare in her community, where other needy children could receive the same love and care she always dedicated to Ethan. Her story inspired other people to look beyond appearances and recognize the value of every human being, regardless of their social origin. Richard, transformed by the experience, became an active advocate for social justice, using his influence and resources to combat prejudice and support families in vulnerable situations. He established a foundation in the name of Claire and Sarah, dedicated to helping single mothers and caregivers who, like Sarah, sacrifice everything for the well-being of others. The genuine friendship that was born from that tragedy forever transformed the lives of everyone involved. Ethan grew up understanding that the true value of a person isn't in their bank account, but in their character. Sarah proved that courage and integrity always win, even when the whole world seems to be against you. And Richard learned that humility and recognition of one's own mistakes are the first step toward true redemption. This story teaches us that our hasty judgments can blind us to the goodness that exists around us. Sarah Williams, a humble nanny from South Central LA, possessed something that all the money in the world cannot buy: a noble heart and the courage to do what's right, even when it means sacrificing everything. She shows us that true heroes often wear simple uniforms and work in the shadows, protecting those they love with a dedication that transcends any material reward. If this story touched your heart and made you reflect on the importance of not judging people by appearance, share this video with your friends and family. Subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell to receive more stories that celebrate the victory of goodness over injustice. And remember, in a world full of prejudice, be like Sarah, see beyond appearances and always do what's right, even when no one is watching.